The drive from Kingman to the Iron Ridge compound took Dorothy Briggs 4 hours and 11 minutes, and she knew the exact time because she had watched the clock on the dashboard, the way she used to watch the clock above the intake desk in the VA emergency room. The way a person watches a clock when they understand that time has weight and the weight of it presses down on everything else. She was 74 years old. Her hair had gone fully white in the years since Calvin disappeared. Not gradually the way hair is supposed to turn, but in the concentrated way of a woman who has absorbed too much at once, and her body has registered it honestly. She drove a 2009 Ford pickup that had belonged to her husband Ray before the heart attack, and the cab still smelled faintly of Ray's work gloves, even after 9 years. And she had never done anything about that smell because she was not a person who did things about smells that still had someone in them. In the passenger seat sat a canvas tote bag containing a thermos of black coffee, a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and a sketchbook bound in dark green cloth with the initials CB pressed into the lower right corner. Not her initials, his. She had found the sketchbook 2 weeks ago when she had finally gone to clear out what was left of Calvin's things from his apartment storage 9 years after the accident. That was not an accident, and she had stood in the middle of that unit holding it for so long that the fluorescent light overhead cycled off on its motion sensor, and she had stood in the dark with it not moving, not doing anything except understanding what she was holding and what it meant that she had found it there. She had not cried. Dorothy Briggs had done all her crying in the years immediately following and had made a decision somewhere around year 3 that crying was for people who still believed the situation might be temporary. She had stopped believing that. What she had not stopped was looking. The road to the Iron Ridge compound wound through scrub desert the color of old bone in dry summer heat that had not broken even in late September because the desert in this part of Arizona took its time releasing anything it had decided to hold. She had written the compound's address on a piece of paper and folded it into her shirt pocket and did not need to look at it again because she had memorized it the same way she had memorized drug dosage charts and blood pressure thresholds and the names of every patient she had ever admitted in 31 years of emergency nursing at the Veterans Administration Hospital outside Kingman. Some people memorize by repetition. Dorothy memorized by understanding why something mattered. This address mattered. It mattered because of the 4th phone call from Victor Langley. Not because of what he had said on that call, because of what his voice had done around the edges of what he said. The space between the controlled professional words. She had been a triage nurse for most of her working life. You learned in that work to hear what people were not saying. The particular quality of controlled urgency that meant someone needed something badly and was working hard not to show you how badly. Langley's voice on the 4th call had that quality in a way the first 3 calls had not. He was getting closer to something. She did not know precisely what, but she knew that a man who had already sent someone to go through her storage closets was not a man she could handle on her own. She had driven past the Iron Ridge compound once before, 2 years after Calvin disappeared, when she was still making the rounds of everyone who had known him. She had not stopped then. The men on the lot had looked at her truck from the gate with the particular watchfulness of people observing something that had wandered into the wrong territory, not hostile exactly, just assessing, and she had kept driving because she had not yet had anything to say that was worth the conversation. Now she had the sketchbook. She turned off the highway onto the gravel access road and felt the tires adjust and heard the crunch of it under the frame of the truck. The compound was larger than she remembered from that single slow pass 2 years after Calvin disappeared. 3 main buildings in a long garage bay running the length of the east side, its roll-up doors open to the morning, and a lot that could hold 100 vehicles easily, and today held close to 80. Out-of-state license plates on a significant portion of the bikes. Flags she recognized from Calvin's descriptions of the organization. A regional gathering of some kind. She had not known about it. She decided it did not change her plan. She parked at the far edge of the lot, away from the rows of motorcycles, and sat for a moment with the engine off and her hands in her lap. Through the windshield, she could see men moving in and out of the garage bay, and smaller clusters of people near the picnic tables along the south fence, and a card game happening under the shade of the east building's overhang. The accumulated ease of a community that had been in the same place for several days already and had settled fully into itself. She reached over and picked up the sketchbook. Calvin had been 31 years old when he disappeared. He had his father Ray's build broad through the shoulders and long in the arm, and Dorothy's own dark eyes. The combination had made him look as a grown man, like someone out of a different era, a person who would have been equally at home in a saddle or at a workbench. He had been riding with the Iron Ridge chapter for 4 years by the time of the charity ride. She had not loved that about him at first, had carried the standard worries of a mother who understood what motorcycles could do to a body, but she had come over time to understand what the chapter was to him. The men he rode with were serious people who took their commitments seriously, and Calvin had always needed that kind of structure around him, the kind that came from genuine, earned trust and shared values, rather than from rules handed down by institutions that had never asked him what he thought. She had not thought of the chapter as allies until the sketchbook showed her what Calvin had been trying to do in the last weeks of his life. Now she thought of little else. She got out of the truck and walked across the lot toward the compound gate. A man near the gate looked up when she was still 30 feet away. Mid-40s, thick through the neck, a cut-off vest with chapter patches she recognized from Calvin's photographs. He watched her approach without moving toward her or away the precise stillness of someone trained to observe before deciding. She walked to him directly. Direct had always been her best speed. It had served her for 31 years in emergency rooms, where ambiguity cost time and time cost lives. "I'm Dorothy Briggs," she said. "Calvin Briggs was my son. I need to speak with whoever runs this chapter." The man held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted in his face. Not recognition exactly, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a person encountering a name they were not prepared to encounter in this context. On this morning, from this particular woman standing in front of them. "Stay here," he said. It was not dismissive. He was being careful, which she appreciated. She waited. In 31 years of emergency medicine, you learn to wait without showing the weight of the waiting. It was one of the most useful skills the work had given her and one of the least acknowledged. She stood with the sketchbook under her arm and watched the garage bay and the light coming through it, and thought about Calvin at 27 years old, sitting at her kitchen table with his coffee, trying to explain to her what it felt like to finally be somewhere that felt like somewhere he genuinely belonged. She had listened. She had understood more than she had let on, because understanding more than you let on was also something emergency nursing had taught her. The man came back with another man behind him. This one was 58 or close to it. Silver hair cut short against his head, arms covered from wrist to shoulder in the accumulated ink of decades, each layer of artwork, the record of a specific era of a specific life. He walked with the particular steadiness of a person who had stopped hurrying through things long ago and had found that things got done just as well, possibly better. His face had the quality of deep stillness that Dorothy recognized from her years in trauma rooms as the face of someone for whom shock was no longer available, who had seen enough of the hard edges of things that the world's capacity to surprise them had been substantially reduced. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with the full weight of genuine attention. "Jack Sullivan," he said. "They call me Hammer." "Dorothy Briggs." She held out the sketchbook. "My son Calvin rode with your chapter for 4 years. He disappeared 9 years ago on a charity ride your organization co-sponsored. I have been trying to find out what happened to him ever since, and I have recently come into possession of information that makes me believe this is where I need to start." Hammer looked at the sketchbook without taking it yet. "What kind of information?" "A man named Victor Langley has contacted me 4 times in the past 2 years, asking to purchase any original artwork my son left behind. He claims they had a prior business arrangement. My son never mentioned this man to me once in his life." She met Hammer's eyes directly. 3 weeks after his last call, someone entered my home while I was out and went through the boxes I have in storage from Calvin's apartment. Nothing was taken. Only those specific boxes were disturbed. The man who had come to get Hammer said nothing, but his jaw had changed. "What's in the sketchbook?" Hammer said. "My son's drawings, and mine." She paused. "I have been painting since before Calvin was born. He learned to draw by watching my hands when he was small. There is something in those pages I want you to see. Hammer studied her for another moment. Then he glanced at the garage bay and back. Come inside, he said. The garage smelled of machine oil and paint solvent, and the particular dry warmth of metal that has absorbed years of Arizona sun. It was organized with the precise efficiency of a space that worked for a living, the kind of organization that develops over decades and becomes so embedded in a place that it looks effortless. Workbenches ran along two walls. The tool organization was institutional in its thoroughness. The floor had the layered marks of decades of serious craft. A dozen men were working or watching or doing the particular thing that people do in functional spaces when a newcomer enters, which is continue what they were doing while tracking the newcomer without appearing to track them. Hammer led Dorothy to a central workbench and cleared a section of it with a single economical gesture. Two men moved to give her room without being asked. Let me see it, Hammer said. Dorothy set the sketchbook on the bench and opened it to the first page without preamble. She had been a nurse. She understood the importance of not preparing people for what they were about to encounter, because preparation changed perception, and she needed Hammer to see this with clear eyes. He looked at the first page. His face did not change. He turned to the second, the third. Somewhere around the fifth page, a man behind him moved closer without appearing to decide to do so, drawn the way people are drawn to something they need to be nearer to, even when they can't yet articulate why. The sketchbook held 60 pages. The first 40 were Calvin's. The last 20 were Dorothy's, her own work from the past 3 years, since she had understood that the only way to know her son fully was to follow the path of what he had made, to trace the lines he had learned against her own lines, and understand where they diverged and where they returned to the same source. What Hammer was looking at was 40 pages in Calvin's hand that spoke with a clarity no verbal description had ever achieved. Calvin Briggs had possessed a gift that had come through Dorothy and through her own father before her, and had arrived in Calvin with a force that sometimes surprised even her. And she had been watching it develop since he was 4 years old, and had drawn an anatomically precise rendering of their kitchen table on the back of a grocery receipt and handed it to her without comment. The gift was a kind of perfect visual memory paired with a technical fearlessness. He did not labor. He saw and he set it down. Motorcycles rendered with mechanical accuracy and emotional truth simultaneously, the way only someone who loved both the machine and the road it ran on could manage. Portraits that captured a specific person in a specific, unrepeatable moment without flattening that moment into mere likeness. And threaded through all of it, the hidden structural choices, the way he built meaning into negative space, the embedded elements worked into compositions that required knowing they were there to find them, the signature flourishes he had learned from her and made entirely his own. The man who had moved closer was Pete Larson. Dorothy would learn his name shortly. He reached the workbench when Hammer was on page 22 and looked at what was there and put one hand on the edge of the bench and gripped it. That's Calvin's hand, Pete said. His voice was low and had something underneath it that was working hard not to surface. Yes, Dorothy said. He taught you these techniques. He was looking at her last 20 pages now, her work, what she had built in 3 years of following her son's path backward and forward simultaneously. I taught him first, Dorothy said. He went further than I did. I spent 3 years learning where he went. Hammer closed the sketchbook with both hands flat on the cover for a moment that was less about checking something and more about steadying himself. Can you paint? He said. I have been painting since I was 12 years old, Dorothy said. 31 years working as a VA emergency nurse, and I still painted every weekend I was not on call. My son got it from somewhere. Hammer looked at the heavy-set man to his left, a member in his mid-40s named Deke, who had been standing with his arms folded and had unfolded them somewhere around page 15 of the sketchbook and had not refolded them. Pull the Sportster tank from the back room, Hammer said. The bare one. Deke looked at him for the brief moment of a man confirming he had heard correctly. Then he went. They gave her a stripped fuel tank off a 1979 Sportster that had been sitting in the back storage room for 2 years with no decision made about it. They gave her access to the professional paint supplies along the back wall, the kind of setup that told her immediately these people took custom work seriously in the way that serious craftspeople recognize in each other's tools without needing it explained. They gave her room and they stepped back. Dorothy set down her tote bag and pushed her reading glasses up and looked at the tank for a full 2 minutes without touching it. She was reading the surface the way 31 years in emergency medicine had trained her to read a patient on admission, taking inventory before taking action, understanding what was there before deciding what was needed. Then she picked up a brush and began. What happened over the next 2.5 hours was something that most of the people in that garage would describe differently later, depending on who asked them. And all of those descriptions would be accurate, because the thing itself contained all of them at once. She was fast and she was slow. She was completely focused and seemed to be watching something other than her own hands. She moved through the work the way she had always moved through difficult procedures in her career, with the quality of attention that comes from understanding that what you are doing matters and that every choice will show in the finished thing. Some of the men drifted away and came back. Some stayed the whole time. By the 90-minute mark, there were 20 people standing around the workbench who had not been there at the start. Pete Larson had ridden with Calvin for 3 of his 4 years with the chapter. He had watched Calvin work in this garage on a dozen Saturday mornings over those years. He stood behind Dorothy at the 2-hour mark and did not move for the remainder of the time she worked, and his jaw held the particular set of a man keeping something together by effort of will. When Dorothy set the brush down and stepped back, the tank held a design that was extraordinary in the specific way that makes it immediately clear the person who made it was not working with effort, but with knowing. The chapter's imagery rendered at a technical level that belonged to someone with decades of practice behind them, and layered within the larger design, nearly invisible unless you understood to look for it, the same hidden structural choices that filled the first 40 pages of the sketchbook. The same signature flourishes, the same compressed logic of a person who believed that what was built into a thing was as important as what rode on its surface. Pete stepped forward and stood in front of the tank for a long time. Then he turned and walked to the far end of the garage and stood there with his back to the room. He was there for several minutes. When he came back, his eyes were red. He did not mention this, and no one else did. Hammer had not looked away from the tank during any of this. When he finally turned to Dorothy, his face held the same deep stillness it had always held, but something had moved underneath it that had not been there before. "Your son painted like this," he said. "My son painted better than this," Dorothy said. "I am what he started with. He went further." Hammer was quiet for a moment. Around them, the sound of the compound continued, engines and voices, and the ordinary noise of 80 people occupying a shared space in the middle of a Saturday morning. None of it touched the particular quiet that had formed around this workbench. "You said a man named Langley has been calling you," Hammer said. "4 times. And someone went through your storage." 3 weeks after his last call, Hammer looked at Pete. Something passed between them that required no words. "You're staying here this weekend," Hammer said to Dorothy. It was not framed as a question, and she did not treat it as one. "That was my intention," she said. "We have rooms in the back building." He looked at her with full attention. "Tomorrow morning early, you're going to sit down with me and Pete and some others, and you're going to tell us everything you know about Victor Langley." He picked up the fuel tank, examined the artwork one final time, set it back down. "And we're going to tell you everything we remember about what happened on that charity ride 9 years ago." Dorothy had been holding herself together for 9 years with the internal discipline of a woman who understood that the truth could not afford for her to fall apart. She held herself together now. "All right," she said. "One more thing," Hammer said. She waited. "Calvin was one of the best people this chapter ever had. Not because of the paintings, though those were something. Because of who he was." He paused. "Whatever you came here looking for, Mrs. Briggs, you're going to find it. But you're going to find things you weren't expecting alongside it. You understand me?" Dorothy Briggs, standing in a garage full of people who had known her son in ways she was only beginning to understand, thought about 4 phone calls and a broken window and 9 years of an absence shaped exactly like her boy. "I understand," she said. She didn't, not fully, but that was about to change. They gave her a room in the back building, small and clean, with a cot and a window that faced the main lot. She sat on the edge of the cot and held the sketchbook in her lap and looked out the window at the evening light crossing the compound and thought about what it meant to be in a building Calvin had walked through in a space that had held him, surrounded by people who carried his memory in the specific ways that people carry the memory of someone they chose rather than someone they were assigned. Grief is not a single thing. Dorothy had learned this over 31 years of standing in the rooms where families received the worst news of their lives. She had watched the same loss land differently in every person who received it, not because the loss was different, but because every relationship was a different country with its own weather and its own particular dark. The people in this compound had lost Calvin too. They had lost him differently than she had. Sitting in that small room, she felt for the first time the full dimension of that truth. How much of his adult life had been shaped here? How much of who he had become in those last years was formed in relationship to these people and this place, and how much of that she had not known because she had not been here to know it. She had been his mother. She had known him completely in certain ways and not at all in others. And that was not failure. That was simply the geometry of a person existing in more than one relationship at a time. She opened the sketchbook to the last page. It was different from every other page in the book. Not a drawing or a design study or a technical reference, but just words written in Calvin's careful hand and a date. The date was 5 days before the charity ride. She had read the words so many times she no longer needed to read them. She read them again anyway. The truth is in the work. If you can't say it out loud, build it in. Someone who knows how to look will find it. She closed the sketchbook. Outside, someone started an engine, and the deep rolling note of it moved through the walls and settled in her chest in a place she had not expected it to reach. She thought about the 5 days between when those words were written and when he had left for the ride. She thought about what a person does in those 5 days when they have already understood that what they have found is dangerous and have already decided they cannot look away from it. They prepare. They set things up so that the truth survives even if they do not. She put her hand flat on the cover of the sketchbook and sat with that for a long time. Pete Larson knocked on her door at 6 in the morning with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who had made decisions about what he was going to say and was now arriving to honor them. She had been awake since 4. She stepped aside to let him in without speaking. He sat in the room's single chair. She sat on the edge of the cot. The coffee was black and strong, and she held it in both hands and waited for him to find a start. "I rode with Calvin for 3 years," he said. "From the summer he came to us until the charity ride." He wrapped both hands around his own cup. "I watched him paint 100 times in this garage. When you were working on that tank yesterday, I had to walk away from the room." "I know," Dorothy said. He looked at her. "Not because it looked like his work." He stopped. "Because it was his work. The exact same decisions, the exact same place his eye went on a surface, the exact same instincts about what to leave alone." He shook his head slowly. "I have been around custom painters for 30 years. I know what influence looks like. I know what imitation looks like. What you did yesterday was neither of those things." "He learned it from me first," Dorothy said. "I was painting before he was born. When he was small, I used to work at the kitchen table after Ray went to sleep, and Calvin would sit in the chair across from me and watch for as long as I let him stay up. I thought I was just keeping him company. He was absorbing everything." "That's exactly what happened," Pete said. He was quiet for a moment, the silence of a man organizing things he had been carrying a long time. "What did he tell you about the charity ride before he left?" "That it was a 3-day run, veterans, families, corporate and private donations, 4 states. He was going as the chapter's representative, and he was proud of that." Dorothy paused. "He called me the second night. He sounded different. Not frightened. Careful the way people sound when they are thinking harder than usual about every word they choose. He said he'd seen something that didn't sit right, and he needed to think about what to do. I asked him what he meant. He said he'd explain when he got back." The silence that followed had weight. "The official version was a single-vehicle accident," Dorothy continued. "Night rural highway, a curve on Route 9 he supposedly misjudged. No witnesses, no other vehicle involved. The investigating officer closed the case in 6 weeks. I've read the file 30 times. It was thin in the places where files get thin when someone has decided they should be thin." "Neither did we," Pete said. We looked for 2 years, paid people to ask questions in places where questions aren't easy to ask. We kept running into nothing, not absence of evidence. The specific presence of nothing that tells you someone has been there before you and cleaned up very carefully. Dorothy absorbed that confirmation. She had known it the way you know things, when the knowing of them has no practical use but refuses to leave you alone. Hearing it said aloud by someone who had run into the same wall from a different direction settled something in her that had been unsettled for 9 years. "What did Calvin tell you before the ride?" she said, "about what he thought he was finding?" Pete looked at his coffee. He said he'd found a discrepancy in the fund accounting for the event. He'd been talking to veterans, families along the road, and what they were describing in terms of the support they received didn't match what was being publicly announced about how much had been raised and what organizations would receive. He said the gap was too large to be a mistake. He said it was systematic. A pause. He said, "Pete, if I find what I think I'm going to find, I need to document it the right way. Not just write it down. Document it the way I know how to document things." The room understood what that meant. Dorothy understood it completely in her bones and her hands. The morning meeting was in the back office, a room that had been accumulating the paperwork of decades along every wall and had a long table scarred with coffee rings and a few paint marks from people who had come in from the garage without quite finishing cleaning up. 7 people gathered. Dorothy was the oldest in the room by at least 15 years. Hammer sat at the head of the table, Pete to his left. To his right, a woman named Rosa, mid-50s, with sharp, economical eyes and the particular efficiency of someone who runs things and has been running them long enough that she no longer needs to announce herself to be understood. Rosa had been the chapter's financial officer for 10 years, including the year Calvin disappeared. 3 senior members filled out the other seats. Carl, a man in his mid-60s, with the deliberate patience of someone who believed that most things became clearer if you waited long enough before speaking. Jimmy, quiet and watchful, and at the far end of the table saying nothing but missing nothing. A man they called Dutch, who had apparently been present at every significant event in the chapter's history for over 30 years and remembered all of it without effort. "Tell us about Langley," Hammer said. "Everything." Dorothy laid it out in the way she had organized it over the past 2 years, clearly and in sequence. Victor Langley, 62 years old, based in Phoenix. Construction and real estate money, primarily with connections to event promotion and charitable fundraising that had built him a public profile resting almost entirely on philanthropy. Hospital wings, scholarship programs, community endowments. The kind of man whose name appeared on buildings and whose photograph ran in the lifestyle section of Phoenix publications 4 or 5 times a year. The first contact had been a letter on heavy professional stationery, and offered to purchase any original artwork created by Calvin Briggs. The offer was generous in a specific way, the generosity of a buyer who wants a particular thing and wants to acquire it without attracting attention. She had ignored it. The second and third contacts were phone calls, polite and professionally controlled, and escalating in urgency in a way designed not to appear to be escalating. He claimed a prior business arrangement with Calvin that entitled him to first consideration on any remaining work. He declined to specify the nature of the arrangement when she asked directly. He said it was a private matter he preferred to discuss in person. She had declined. The fourth call had the qualities she had described driving here, the controlled urgency underneath the professionalism. The voice of a man who is running out of patience with being patient. 3 weeks after that call, someone had been in her home. "What were they looking for?" Rosa asked. "Artwork," Dorothy said. Calvin's remaining paintings, whatever he had produced in the weeks immediately before the charity ride. He had a studio in his apartment. "I packed it up after he disappeared. I have most of the contents in my home storage. But Calvin had a separate storage unit on Route 9 that he rented independently, and that unit I never cleared out." Hammer and Pete exchanged a look. "Why not?" Hammer said. "Because I couldn't at first, not for the first few years. And then I had a reason not to." She looked at her hands. "If I cleared it and found nothing, I lost the possibility. If I left it, whatever was there was still there. 2 weeks ago, I finally went ready to clear it regardless. The sketchbook was on top of everything, set there to be found first. She paused. There is more in that unit. I did not go through everything, but I believe what is there is what Langley has been looking for. Carl said very quietly, there's another storage unit on Route 9 that we need to talk about. Everyone at the table looked at him. He had the expression of a man about to set down something he had been carrying alone for a long time. He placed his hands flat on the table and looked at Dorothy. The chapter kept a separate unit at the same facility, Carl said. Unit 14, Calvin used it for overflow work reference materials pieces he wasn't currently working on but wasn't ready to let go of. When he disappeared, we paid the rent on it for 3 years. He paused. Then the facility changed owners. The new owner man named Garrett called us and said he'd been holding the unit out of respect, but he was considering selling the property and we needed to decide what to do. He looked at the table. I went out there. I had a key. I stood in front of that door and I put my hand on it and I could not open it. I didn't know what I was looking for. I didn't know what was in there. I just knew that opening it without knowing felt wrong, like I'd missed something. Like whatever was there deserved the right person to be the one to find it. He looked at Dorothy. So I locked it back up. I paid for another year of storage out of my own pocket and I told Garrett to hold it. 6 years ago, Hammer said. 6 years ago. I've been sending Garrett a check every 6 months. He never asked questions. The table was very quiet. Dorothy looked at Carl and understood what those 6 years had cost a person in the particular currency of wondering whether you had made the right call. Take me there today, she said. They went that afternoon. Garrett, a man in his late 60s with the weathered patience of someone who had been doing one thing long enough that most other things had stopped surprising him, met them at the gate of the storage facility on Route 9 and looked at Dorothy when Carl introduced her. Calvin's mother, he said, not a question. He was quiet for a moment. I should have done more. I never knew who to call. You waited, Dorothy said. That was the right thing. He led them to Unit 14 at the back of the row. Carl had the padlock key on a ring he had carried in his pocket for 6 years. Dorothy watched his face as he approached the door, the expression of a man approaching something he has been keeping in trust for longer than he expected and is now ready to pass forward. The lock opened. The door rolled up. The smell came first. Turpentine and linseed oil and dry stored canvas, and underneath all of it, barely there, the ghost of Calvin's studio that she had thought she had lost completely 9 years ago and had apparently been keeping without knowing it, in whatever part of the mind holds the memories you most need to survive. She stood in the entrance and breathed it. Nobody spoke. She stepped inside. The unit was organized with the precise logic of someone who knew exactly where everything was and fully expected to return for it. Reference books in labeled crates, supply boxes stacked by type and medium, wooden frames along the left wall, and along the back wall in flat storage racks canvases. Dozens of them stacked and sorted and waiting. Dorothy moved through the space the way Calvin had taught her to move through a collection, reading surfaces, first understanding context before touching anything, seeing the whole before going to any part of it. She was methodical and she was slow and no one asked her to hurry. She was in the third rack when she stopped. Her hand was resting on the edge of something wrapped differently from everything else around it. Heavier, rolled rather than stretched and flat wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth, tied with a double knot she recognized before she had consciously registered recognizing it. She had taught him that knot. It was the knot she used when wrapping work she needed to protect from humidity and slow damage, the knot she had shown him when he was 19 and she had found an early canvas warped because he hadn't understood yet how to store oil work properly. She had sat at the kitchen table and shown him the double wrap and the particular knot, and told him if you want it to last, you have to protect it like it matters. He had watched her hands and learned it in one sitting and never forgotten it. She stood looking at the wrapped roll without moving. That's it, Pete said behind her. He couldn't see what she saw, but he could see her, and he had been watching her long enough by now to understand when she had found something that mattered. She moved the surrounding canvases with care and lifted the wrapped roll free of the rack. It was heavy in the way of serious canvas, carrying serious paint. She carried it to the cleared space near the open door where the afternoon light came in and set it upright and untied the knot and began to unroll it slowly, walking the canvas out section by section, with her knee holding one end down and her hands walking forward. At first, it looked like an accident scene. A motorcycle and a vehicle on a night road, the brushwork dark and expressionistic in the style Calvin used for serious emotional work, the style he had developed far beyond anything she had taught him, the place where his gift operated at its deepest level. The scene was violent and chaotic and real, with the specific realness that only first-hand witness creates, not imagined, not staged. The record of something a person had seen and could not unsee, and had needed to set down before that seeing was lost. She kept unrolling. In the center of the composition, among the darkness and the motion of the crash, three faces, painted with a precision that had nothing to do with the expressionism surrounding them. Portrait-grade clarity, photographic accuracy, the kind that can only come from someone who has seen those faces clearly and has remembered them with the specific fidelity of a person who understands exactly why the memory matters. Dorothy had spent 31 years in emergency medicine. She did not flinch from difficult things. She looked at each face in turn and held each one in her mind the way she had been trained to hold important information fully and without rushing past it. One face she did not recognize. One face she had seen in a Phoenix News segment about a charitable hospital dedication 6 months ago. One face she had seen at the top of a letter in her kitchen drawer. Victor Langley. She made herself keep unrolling. The lower section was different from the upper. Not the crash scene, but something denser and more deliberate. The kind of layered visual complexity Calvin used when he was building information into a composition, the way a structural engineer builds load-bearing elements into a wall, invisibly necessarily with everything else resting on it. Dates rendered as part of the decorative borderwork. Numbers embedded in the negative space of the design. And text, actual legible text, small and precise and protected, woven into the composition in a way that required knowing it was there to find it. Dorothy leaned close. She had spent 3 years learning to read what Calvin built into his work. She began to read. She read for a long time. Behind her, the four men were silent. Hammer crouched on one knee. Pete stood with one hand on the doorframe. Carl had his phone out, but was not looking at it. Garrett had stepped back to the fence and was looking at the sky. When Dorothy sat back on her heels, the storage unit was the quietest it had ever been. The highway carried its sound in from a distance, and the light came through the open door at a long angle and fell across the canvas and across the faces Calvin had painted with his last careful hours of work. "What does it say?" Hammer asked. His voice was the voice of a man who had been waiting 9 years for this moment and was trying not to break it with the wrong word. Dorothy looked up at him. Her eyes were dry. She had decided somewhere in the past few minutes that she was not going to fall apart in this unit, that she was going to hold herself together long enough to say what needed to be said, because Calvin had built this to be found and read and used, not only to be wept over. "My son did not die in a single vehicle accident," she said. "He was run off the road. The crash in this painting is the crash. He survived it long enough to get to this unit and document everything he had found." She looked at the canvas. The charity funds. Langley was running a diversion scheme through the fundraising events, pulling money into shell accounts before it reached the veterans organizations. Calvin traced the mechanism. He documented specific transactions, specific account, routing information, specific dates, all of it embedded in this composition. And the three faces in the crash scene are the 3 men who ran him off the road. The silence that followed was the silence of a completed thing finally arriving. "One of them is Langley," Pete said. "One of them is Langley," Dorothy confirmed. Carl dialed. His hands were completely steady. "I'm calling Gerald Hoy," he said, and stepped outside. Hammer had not moved from his crouch. He was looking at the painting with an expression that Dorothy had no name for: grief and fury, and something older and quieter than either, the expression of a man confronting the full shape of something he had carried incompletely for 9 years. He looked at Dorothy. "Calvin knew someone would find this eventually," Hammer said. "He built it so the right person would find it." Dorothy looked at the canvas, at the faces her son had recorded with everything he had, at the text he had woven into the composition in the language she had given him, the language he had made his own, and use finally for the most important thing he ever needed to say. "He built it for me," she said. "He just didn't know it would take this long." Outside, the desert afternoon was burning gold, the way it burned every afternoon, indifferent to the specific weight of what was happening inside Unit 14 on a Route 9 storage lot in Kingman, Arizona. 9 years. Her boy had been waiting 9 years in a rolled canvas under a double-knotted oilcloth, wrapping patient, as paint patient, as truth patient, as a mother who had never stopped looking. She put her hand on the corner of the canvas. She did not say anything aloud. She did not need to. Carl came back in from the parking lot with the phone still in his hand and the particular expression of a man who has set an irreversible sequence in motion and is at peace with that. "Gerald Hoy is driving out tonight," Carl said. "He said do not touch anything else in the unit. Do not photograph the canvas on personal devices. Do not discuss the specifics beyond the people in this room." He paused. "He said this is significant." Dorothy looked at the painting laid out on the tarp of the storage unit floor, at the faces her son had rendered with everything he had left at the end, at the hidden text that had waited 9 years under a double-knotted oilcloth wrapping for someone with the right eyes to come looking. She thought about Calvin at 19 years old, learning the double knot at her kitchen table, watching her hands with the focused attention he had always brought to learning things he cared about. She thought about him at 31 in this unit in the dark, injured, tying that knot for the last time. He had done everything right. He had trusted the work, and the work had held. She stood up slowly, and Pete was there to offer a hand without making a production of the offering. She took it without comment. He helped her up with the quiet matter-of-factness of a man who had been around enough older women to understand that accepting help was not the same thing as needing rescue. "I need to call my daughter-in-law," Dorothy said. "Calvin's wife, Renee. She has a right to know something has been found." Hammer nodded. "Take whatever time you need." Dorothy walked to the open door of the unit and stood in the late afternoon light with the desert spread out behind the storage facility's fence line, flat and spare and indifferent in the way that large landscapes are indifferent to the specific weight of specific human moments happening inside them. She dialed. 3 rings, then Mom. Renee's voice, 46 years old, the voice of a woman who had been a widow at 37 and had raised 2 children by herself and had never once in 9 years suggested to Dorothy directly or indirectly that she should stop looking. "Renee," Dorothy said, "I'm in Kingman. I found something." A silence on the other end. Not shocked. The silence of someone who has been preparing for a call like this for a very long time and is now receiving it and finding that all the preparation in the world does not make receiving it simple. "Tell me," Renee said. Dorothy told her the shape of it. Not all the specifics, not the details that needed to stay close, but enough. The storage unit, the painting, what the painting documented, what the painting proved. When she finished, the silence stretched out longer than the first one. "He knew," Renee said finally. Her voice was the most controlled Dorothy had ever heard it, which meant she was working very hard. "He called me the second night of the ride. He said he loved me, and he said to tell the children he loved them, and he said if anything ever happened, he needed me to know that he had tried to do the right thing." A pause. "I didn't know what to do with that for 9 years. I still don't entirely, but I'm glad you found it. I'm glad it wasn't nothing." "It was never nothing," Dorothy said. He made sure of that. After she hung up, she stood in the doorway for a moment more and thought about a young man on the second night of a charity ride calling his wife to say, "I love you," and tell the children because he had already understood what he had found and had already decided he could not look away from it and had done one quiet human thing before the harder thing. She went back inside. Gerald Hoy arrived at 7 the following morning in a dark gray suit that looked aggressively out of place in the compound parking lot. He was 61 years old, compact and precise, with silver-rimmed glasses, and the careful eyes of someone who had spent 3 decades reading situations the way other people read text. He shook Dorothy's hand with both of his and held it for a moment. "I knew Calvin," he said. "He did restoration work on a piece my wife commissioned years ago. We had dinner twice afterward. He was a careful person and a principled one. I'm glad you found it, Mrs. Briggs. I'm glad you're here." He released her hand. "Let's go look at this painting." He had brought a professional photographer and a forensic art consultant named Dr. Caroline Marsh, who worked primarily with federal courts and insurance litigation, and who communicated in the particular focused economy of an expert who had been doing serious work long enough that she had stopped finding it necessary to narrate her process while performing it. They went back to the unit. Dr. Marsh spent 90 minutes examining the canvas on the tarp with the concentrated attention of someone building a complete picture before saying a single word. Dorothy stood to the side and watched. Hammer stood beside her with his arms crossed and did not speak, which she had come to understand was his way of being present. When Dr. Marsh finally straightened up, she looked at Hoy over her glasses. Paint chemistry is consistent with the period. Aging signatures are right for something executed 9 to 11 years ago. Lab analysis will confirm, but the visual evidence is unambiguous. She paused. The embedded text is original to the painting. It sits under the final glazing layer, which means it was part of the original composition, not added afterward. Whoever built this understood preservation. The text is protected inside the work, not applied on top of it. Can it be fully read? Hoy asked. Most of it is legible to the naked eye if you know to look for it. Some passages need magnification, but they're intact. The dates and numbers in the border work are completely clear. She looked at Dorothy. Did your son have any formal background in documentation, legal, or forensic training? Not formal, Dorothy said, but he was meticulous. He believed that if something was worth recording, it was worth recording in a way that lasted. Dr. Marsh nodded slowly. He recorded this correctly. Hoy turned to Dorothy. He laid it out carefully and directly. The painting constituted physical evidence of witness testimony. Calvin had documented what he had observed. The financial data encoded in the composition correlated with public records already accessible, showing discrepancies in charitable fund distributions from that period. The three faces, combined with the timeline documented in the border work, gave investigators specific individuals in a specific sequence of events. This is significant, Hoy said. Is it enough? Dorothy asked. It is enough to reopen the investigation into your son's death and to initiate a formal inquiry into Langley's financial activities from that period. Whether it leads to prosecution depends on what investigators find when they begin pulling threads. He looked at her steadily. Mrs. Briggs, this is 9-year-old evidence. Langley has had 9 years to manage his exposure. This is a beginning, not an ending. What do we do now? Now we do this completely by the book so that nothing Langley's attorneys can say later undermines the integrity of what your son left behind. He looked at Hammer. And now Victor Langley finds out that he has been looking in the wrong places for 9 years. Within 48 hours, the first development arrived from a direction Dorothy had not anticipated. Rosa appeared at the back office door the following morning with a legal pad covered in her own handwriting and the compressed energy of someone who had been working through the night and had found what she was looking for. I pulled public financial records, Rosa said. She laid the pad on the table. Every charitable event Langley organized or co-organized in this state over the past 15 years. I found 6 separate events with significant discrepancies between publicly announced fundraising totals and independently reported distributions to beneficiary organizations. She paused. 6 events over 14 years, each one using a different name, different public beneficiaries, different promotional structure, but the same underlying mechanism every time. Money raised, money diverted, organizations receiving substantially less than publicly announced. Dorothy looked at the numbers. The total across all 6 events was a number that looked at directly made the room go silent in the specific way that numbers rarely achieve. The veterans' families from Calvin's ride, Rosa continued, her voice steady, received less than 40% of what was publicly announced. Dorothy looked at that figure for a long time. She thought about her son on the second night of the ride, talking to families along the route, watching donations come in, understanding over 3 days what was happening to money that men and women who had served their country were depending on to manage real hardship. She thought about him deciding he could not look away, deciding that the right way to document it was the way he knew best, the only way he trusted to outlast everything else. She pressed her palms flat on the table. "Gerald," she said. Rosa was already picking up her phone. "Tell him we have the pattern," Dorothy said. "Tell him it goes back 14 years and crosses state lines." She looked up. "Tell him it is time to stop being careful and start being loud." The second development came 2 days after that, and it came from Ray Bowen. Hoy had tracked down Bowen through old departmental records. Bowen was 63 years old, retired 4 years, a former state investigator who had worked the original case of Calvin's disappearance for 8 months before the file was closed. When Hoy reached him and described what had been found, Bowen went quiet for long enough that Hoy had to ask if he was still on the line. "I'm here," Bowen said. "I kept a personal file." The call happened on speaker in the back office with Dorothy and Hammer and Pete present. Bowen's voice came through with the quality of something that had been compressed under pressure for 9 years and was now being allowed to decompress. "When a case gets closed in a way that doesn't sit right, you keep a file," Bowen said. "I've had the Parker file in my garage since the day I turned in my badge." He said there had been a witness, a gas station attendant on Route 9, who had told investigators he saw a motorcycle go off the road and saw a second vehicle, a dark-colored SUV, stop briefly and then accelerate away. The statement had been in the initial case file. Then it had not been. Someone had removed it from the official record. "I kept my own copy," Bowen said. "I always kept my own copies when a case felt wrong." The SUV make and partial plate from the witness description matched a vehicle registered to a holding company that Langley had operated during that period. "I've known what it looked like for 9 years," Bowen said. "I just never had anything to attach it to." Dorothy said, "Mr. Bowen, thank you for keeping that file." A long pause. "Mrs. Briggs, I'm sorry it took this long for it to matter. I'm sorry I couldn't do more when it would have made a difference." "You kept the truth," Dorothy said. "That made a difference. My son would have understood that." After the call ended, the office was quiet for a moment. Then Hammer said, "Langley is going to hear about the painting. Not a question of if." "I know," Dorothy said. "When he does, he moves. Men like him move when they feel the ground shifting. He'll try to discredit the painting, discredit the chain of custody. He'll make it look like a grieving old woman in a motorcycle chapter with a grudge manufactured a story about a respected public figure." Dorothy looked at him steadily. "Let him try. Calvin built that painting to survive exactly that kind of attack. He built it to be authenticated. He built it to be read by someone who understood what they were looking at." She looked around the table. "Dr. Marsh understands what she is looking at. Hoy understands the law. Bowen has a witness statement that was buried and survived. Calvin spent the last hours of his life making sure the truth was harder to destroy than he was. The least I can do is trust the work." Hammer looked at her for a long time and then said quietly, "You sound like him." "Good," Dorothy said. She meant it. Victor Langley's first move came 3 days later, faster than anyone had expected. And it came not through lawyers, but through a Phoenix Entertainment blog that ran a short, dismissive piece questioning the authenticity of artwork recently surfaced from a storage unit and attributed to the late Calvin Briggs. The piece cited unnamed art community sources who doubted that a grieving elderly woman with no professional credentials could reliably authenticate complex custom work. It was casual and precisely calibrated, not substantial enough to respond to directly, but designed to plant just enough doubt to be useful later in other venues. Dorothy read it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold, and Rosa across from her watching her face. "He wants you reactive," Rosa said. "I know," Dorothy said. "He wants me to make a public statement, get emotional, give him something to build a narrative around." She set the phone down. "What do you know about his public reputation, the charity work specifically?" Rosa's eyes sharpened. "Why?" "Because if we go into a courtroom with a 9-year-old painting in a reopened investigation, Langley's defense is going to be reputation. Community standing, philanthropy. He is going to say Calvin was unstable, that the painting is the obsessive projection of a troubled young man, that any financial irregularities were long-corrected bookkeeping errors." Dorothy paused. "We need more than the painting. We need the pattern. How many events? How many times the questions were buried? We need the full 14 years. Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Give me 24 hours." Rosa was back in 18, working with Jimmy and a contact at a nonprofit watchdog organization. She had built a complete picture of Langley's methodology across all 6 events. Not isolated incidents. A system refined over 14 years, the same diversion structure applied with increasing sophistication across different charitable contexts. Different states, different beneficiary organizations, always resolving quietly or not resolving at all. The most recent event had occurred less than 2 years ago. He had not stopped. He had slowed down and become more careful, but he had not stopped, which meant that under any legal framework involving ongoing fraud, the statute of limitations conversation changed entirely. Dorothy looked at the documentation for a long time. Then she called Hoy and told him to put all 6 events and all 6 discrepancies into his response to whatever Langley's attorneys filed next. Full documentation, public record before Langley understood how much they had found. "That's aggressive," Hoy said. "Calvin did not run from what he found," Dorothy said. "He documented it and trusted the work to outlast the people trying to bury it." She paused. "I am his mother." Langley's attorneys filed a civil claim 4 days later asserting that the artwork in Unit 14 constituted property subject to a contractual arrangement between Langley Enterprises and Calvin Briggs, and that ownership of the painting reverted to Langley upon the artist's death. The claim was elegant in the way of legal maneuvers designed not necessarily to win, but to delay and to create the appearance of legitimate dispute where there was none. It was also, Dorothy recognized immediately, a mistake. "He just put himself in court," Hoy said when he called with the news. The satisfaction in his voice was quiet but present. "He is claiming a business relationship with your son. He will have to document that relationship. He will have to provide evidence of this commission arrangement." A pause. "When he cannot because it did not exist, the question becomes why he is claiming one." "He panicked," Hammer said. He was sitting across the table from Dorothy in the back office. "He heard about Bowen's statement," Dorothy said. "He heard about the painting entering the legal process, and he panicked. But he is panicking in a controlled way, which is what people like him do. He still thinks he can win this on paper. He does not know about the 14-year pattern." She called Hoy back. "When you respond to that filing, I want the full 14-year financial pattern in the response. All 6 events. Complete documentation from the watchdog organization." She paused. "I want it in the public record before he realizes how much we have." "That is aggressive," Hoy said again. "My son documented fraud at the cost of his life," Dorothy said. "The minimum we can do is be loud about it." Hoy filed the response on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Langley's attorneys had gone quiet in the specific way that means the other side is reading very carefully what has just been put in front of them and having difficult private conversations. Langley then retained Marcus Vance, senior partner at a prominent Phoenix civil litigation firm, the kind of attorney whose involvement in a case was itself a public statement. His client list included major corporate defendants who had made problems disappear that should not have disappeared. He was very good at his work in the specific way of people who have won consistently enough that losing has become theoretically conceivable but practically unfamiliar. "He's not trying to settle," Dorothy said when Hammer showed her the news. "No," Hammer said. "He is going to war." "Good," Dorothy said. Hammer looked at her. "Vance is going to target you," Hammer said. "Not the painting, not the evidence directly. You, your credibility, your motives, your emotional investment. He is going to argue that a 74-year-old woman who lost her son cannot be a reliable source for a 9-year-old canvas that conveniently implicates a prominent community figure. He is going to be methodical about it." "I know," Dorothy said. "You have never been in a courtroom, Mrs. Briggs." "My son did not run from what he found," Dorothy said. "He documented it and trusted that the truth was harder to destroy than the people trying to bury it." She looked at Hammer. "I am not running." Hammer studied her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and began making calls. Dorothy did not know who he called first. She would learn later that by 9 o'clock that morning, he had made 11 calls, every one of them to a chapter officer or senior member or longtime brother who had known Calvin. Every call was brief. Every call ended with 2 words "we're in." He had 47 yes answers by the end of the 4th day. Not everyone on the lot, not all 90 members of the extended gathering. 47 people who had known Calvin Briggs in different capacities, in different eras, and were willing to stand in front of a court and say so. Dorothy heard the number and had to leave the room for a few minutes. When she came back, Pete was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had spent weeks learning when she needed space and when she needed to not be alone in something. 47 people, she said. 47, he said. She was quiet then. He would have thought he wasn't worth that. Pete looked at her. He would have been wrong. She knew that. She sat down and picked up her coffee. Pete, she said, the Saturday mornings, when Calvin used to come out here to work. You were here for most of them. The last 2 years before the ride, yes, almost all of them. What was he like on those mornings? She paused. Not the painter, not the chapter member, just the man. What was he like being somewhere he wanted to be? Pete looked at her for a long time. His eyes did the thing that old grief does when it is given permission to surface, at last, the specific softness that comes from a wound that has been waiting years to be acknowledged properly. He was the most settled I ever saw him, Pete said slowly. Calvin in the outside world was always slightly on alert. You could feel it, a kind of low monitoring running all the time underneath everything else. But in that garage on a Saturday morning with work in front of him, all of that went quiet. He was completely in the room. He would get into a piece and the world could go on around him, and he would just be in the work. He paused. He used to bring coffee for whoever was there when he arrived. He never asked how people took it. He just knew. He paid attention to that kind of small thing, what people needed without being told. That's the kind of person he was. Another pause. He talked about you regularly. He said you were the most self-sufficient person he had ever known, and the way he said it made it clear he meant it as the highest possible compliment. Like he valued self-sufficiency above almost anything else. Dorothy looked at her hands. She had always worried she had modeled too much self-sufficiency for him, that she had made competence look like not needing anyone. He needed this place, she said quietly. He did, Pete said. And this place needed him. That is not a small thing, Mrs. Briggs. That is actually the whole thing. She sat with that. It was, she thought, exactly right. Hoy held a full strategy meeting 2 days before the preliminary hearing. The conference room at his firm held Dorothy and Hammer and Pete and Rosa and Carl and Dutch and Ray Bowen, who had driven 4 hours to be present. Also at the table, Dr. Marsh, a forensic accounting analyst named Sandra Webb, whose specialty was charitable fund structures, and 2 attorneys from a veterans advocacy organization that had been among the intended recipients of Langley's diverted funds. That last addition had been Rosa's idea, and it changed the character of everything. The moment the veterans organization entered the proceedings, this stopped being about one painting and one man's death and became something substantially larger. They had legal standing. The funds diverted from their allocation across 6 events over 14 years represented a quantifiable harm they could join the civil action to address, which expanded the scope of discovery dramatically. We can compel financial records going back 14 years, one of the Veterans Organization attorneys said. She was in her mid-40s, efficient and direct. Not just the charitable events, the full structure of the entities Langley used to move the money. Every shell company, every holding account, every transfer. She paused. What your son documented was the skeleton. Discovery builds the body around it. Hoy nodded. Vance is going to try to narrow the scope of this case to the painting's authenticity and Mrs. Briggs's credibility. We expand the scope every time he tries to narrow it. He will claim the 14-year financial matters fall outside the statute of limitations, the veteran's attorney said flatly. Criminal fraud has no statute of limitations in this state when the fraud is ongoing. The most recent event we have documented was less than 2 years ago. The room absorbed that. Dorothy looked at Sandra Webb. Is that confirmed? Confirmed and fully documented, Webb said. The 4th event in the pattern is recent. Small compared to the earlier ones, but the mechanism is identical. A pause. Either he believed he was completely safe or he could not stop. Possibly both. Dorothy thought about a man who had attended charity galas for 9 years and had his name put on buildings and had called a 74-year-old woman 4 times and had sent someone through her closets and had never once stopped. She thought about what that quality of certainty cost and what it revealed about the kind of person who carried it. He thought Calvin's evidence died with him, Dorothy said. Yes, Hoy said. And when my calls from Langley started, he assumed I had something but didn't know what I had. Dorothy looked at Hoy. He thought he had time. He thought he could acquire the paintings quietly and keep going. She paused. He didn't know about Unit 14. Nobody knew about Unit 14, Hammer said, except Carl. Carl said nothing. His jaw held the tight set of a man carrying something heavy who has chosen not to put it down yet. Carl, Dorothy said quietly. He looked at her. You kept the key for 6 years, she said. You kept the rent paid for 3 years before that. You didn't let anyone touch it. She paused. You were waiting. I didn't know what I was waiting for, Carl said. His voice was rough. I just knew that unit was Calvin's and it wasn't right to let it go without the right person deciding what to do with it. He looked at his hands. Turns out I was waiting for you. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Hoy cleared his throat gently and brought the room back to the work, because the work was the only path forward, and because Gerald Hoy was a man who understood that grief and strategy were not mutually exclusive, but that conflating them in a conference room the week before a hearing served neither. Vance's first major courtroom move came exactly as Dorothy had predicted. He filed a motion challenging the chain of custody and simultaneously released a statement to Phoenix media describing Dorothy as a devoted but misguided elderly woman whose understandable grief had led her to misidentify coincidental technical similarities and to level serious accusations against a respected community leader. The statement was 3 paragraphs and contained no specific legal argument. It was entirely designed to establish a narrative before the facts could be formally adjudicated, to make the picture in people's minds the picture of a sad old woman and a rough organization with a grudge before anyone had to look directly at the painting. Dorothy read it and called Hoy. I want to paint, she said. A pause. What? Vance's argument rests on the premise that my identification of Calvin's techniques is not expert knowledge but emotional projection. I want to remove that argument before it reaches a judge. Her voice was even. I want to demonstrate formally and on record that I understand Calvin's methodology at a structural level, that I can produce work in my own developed style and in faithful execution of his documented techniques, and that an expert panel can distinguish between them clearly. That is not grief. That is knowledge built over a lifetime. Hoy was quiet. That's actually quite smart. Calvin taught me to build arguments you can hold in your hands, Dorothy said. Let me build this one. 2 days later, in the presence of Dr. Marsh and 2 additional forensic art consultants retained by Hoy, Dorothy sat at the workbench in the Iron Ridge garage and painted. She worked for 3.5 hours. She produced 2 pieces. The first was entirely hers, the style she had developed over 60 years of working her own instincts and her own accumulated history in every choice. The second was a deliberate, faithful execution of Calvin's documented techniques, the specific structural decisions, the hidden compositional logic, the borderwork methodology, the signature flourish in the lower left corner that she had taught him at 17, and that he had then made completely his own. The 3 consultants examined both pieces for 80 minutes afterward. Their written consensus used the phrase deep structural inheritance and noted that the second piece demonstrated not familiarity with Calvin Briggs's methods, but thorough internal understanding of their logic at a level consistent with direct instruction over an extended period. Not forgery, Dr. Marsh said, not imitation, origin. Vance loses the credibility argument, Hoy said that evening. The record now showed clearly and demonstrably that Dorothy Briggs knew exactly what she was looking at. He is going to pivot, Dorothy said. Yes, the question is to what? He is going to go after the chapter. She had been thinking about this since she read the initial press statement. He is going to argue that Hammer and the others influenced my interpretation, that the environment I walked into was inherently biased, that 90 people who love my son cannot be objective about evidence connected to his death. She paused. It is the only move he has left that does not require him to directly attack the painting's authenticity, which he cannot do because Dr. Marcia's analysis is bulletproof. Hoy was quiet. That is exactly what I would do. It is what a frightened man does when he has run out of better options, Dorothy said. He has been frightened since the night Calvin decided not to look away. He has just had 9 years to get very good at not showing it. Vance's pivot came as anticipated, and it came fast, which confirmed that Langley was operating from something close to panic dressed as strategy. A new filing argued that the evidence had been handled, interpreted and promoted exclusively by members of an organization with a documented adversarial history, whose interest in implicating Langley was personal and retaliatory rather than evidentiary. It named Hammer specifically. It named Pete. It made careful reference to the chapter's history in a way that was legally precise and reputationally damaging without alleging specific crimes, letting reader assumptions do the work. Dorothy was in the main room when Hammer read the filing on his phone. She watched his face. He read everything fully before deciding what he thought. He named you too, Hammer said, at the end, as someone who arrived at the chapter seeking support for a personal grievance. I know, Dorothy said. She had read Hoy's forwarded copy 30 minutes earlier. He is betting that the picture in people's minds is louder than the facts. He wants a jury or a judge or the public to see a motorcycle club and an emotional old woman instead of witnesses and documented evidence. She looked around the room at Pete and Rosa and Carl and Dutch and Deke and the others who had come to be present for something they did not fully understand but had decided mattered. I want every person in this chapter who knew Calvin to be willing to testify, she said. Not about the painting, about him, who he was, what he stood for, why they trusted him. I want the court to see that the people vouching for this evidence are not a grievance organization. They are witnesses to a man's character. Pete said carefully, some of our people have complicated histories with courtrooms. I know, Dorothy said. I am asking anyway. She looked at Hammer. Vance wants a jury to see a stereotype. I want them to see the truth. That is all Calvin ever wanted. It took Hammer 4 days. He made individual calls and individual conversations and sat across from people who needed to understand exactly what they were agreeing to before they agreed to it. He was not asking for heroes. He was asking for people who could stand and tell the truth about a man they had known and let the truth do its work. 47 yes answers. Dorothy heard the number and walked outside and stood in the lot for a few minutes by herself. When she came back, her face was composed. 47, she said. 47, Pete confirmed. She picked up her coffee and drank it. It had gone cold. She did not mind. The night before the preliminary hearing, she sat alone at the workbench and painted her son's hands. She had carried those hands in memory since he was small, watching them develop from a toddler's uncertain grip on a crayon to the confident instrument of a serious artist, her husband Ray's hands in their shape, but hers in what they had learned to do. She worked for 2 hours, and when she finished, she sat back and looked at what she had made and understood that it was the truest thing she had ever produced, not because of technique, but because of what it held. She set it aside to dry. She went to her room and slept because she was a practical woman and because Calvin had learned from her that rest was part of the work. The courthouse parking lot at 7:30 in the morning held the flat, clear light of a day not yet decided. Hoy was already inside with his team. The Veterans Organization attorneys were in a coffee shop 2 blocks away. Ray Bowen had driven up the night before and was staying at the motel on the edge of town. Dorothy arrived with Hammer and Pete and Rosa in Hammer's truck. When they walked through the courthouse entrance, the security officer at the desk looked at Hammer, took in the vest and the patches and the silver hair and the physical presence of a man who had lived a long time in a certain way, and then looked at Dorothy and then looked past both of them through the glass doors at the parking lot. The parking lot was filling with motorcycles. 47 of them arriving in clusters of 3 and 4 and 5, unhurried and precise, pulling into available spaces with the collective economy of people who had done this kind of thing together long enough that it required no coordination. They're with her, Hammer said to the officer, nodding toward Dorothy. Dorothy walked through the security line and straightened her jacket. The hallway ahead was long and institutional and lit with the indifferent fluorescence of public buildings. Somewhere past these doors, Victor Langley and Marcus Vance were preparing to argue that her son's final work was too old and too contaminated by association and too bound up in an old woman's grief to deserve serious judicial attention. She thought about the words Calvin had written 5 days before the charity ride. The truth is in the work. If you can't say it out loud, build it in. Someone who knows how to look will find it. She had found it. Now it was time to let it speak. The preliminary hearing lasted 4 hours. Vance was very good in the specific way of attorneys who have won so consistently that losing has become theoretically possible but practically abstract. He challenged the chain of custody on the painting with surgical precision. He questioned Dr. Marsh's methodology with technical depth that required serious preparation. He made the 14-year financial pattern sound like coincidence, assembled by motivated reasoning. He was controlled and methodical and deeply effective at making complexity feel like doubt. Dorothy sat beside Hoy with her hands flat on the table and her face still. She did not look at Langley, who sat 15 feet away with the composed expression of a man who had survived difficult rooms before and expected to survive this one. When Vance finished his opening, Hoy leaned close to Dorothy. "He's good." "I know," Dorothy said. "Continue." What Hoy did over the next 90 minutes was not dramatic. It was methodical and relentless, and built from the ground up each piece necessary to the next. He walked the judge through the forensic authentication timeline using Dr. Marsh's analysis as foundation. He layered Sandra Webb's 14-year financial documentation on top of it. He placed Ray Bowen's recovered witness statement at the precise point in the timeline where it completed the picture most cleanly. He did not raise his voice once. Vance objected 6 times. The judge sustained 2 and overruled 4. When Hoy sat down, the courtroom held a different quality of silence than the one it had started with. The judge, a woman in her late 50s named Carolyn Avery, with the focused patience of someone who had spent a career distinguishing complicated cases from cases someone was trying to make. Complicated, looked at her notes for a sustained moment before speaking. "I'm going to allow the civil claim to proceed," she said. "I'm also referring the financial documentation to the State Attorney General's office for review." She looked at Vance. "That is not a determination of guilt. It is an acknowledgement that what has been presented today warrants serious examination by the appropriate authorities." She gathered her papers. "Counsel, your client's ownership claim will be heard on its merits. I would suggest those merits be substantial." She adjourned. Vance was on his phone before he cleared the courtroom doors. Langley followed without looking at anyone. His pace steady, his expression neutral, the performance of a man who had been in difficult rooms before. But as he passed the defense table, his gaze moved involuntarily toward the canvas photographs in Hoy's case files. Just for a fraction of a second. Just long enough. Dorothy had her son's eyes. She saw it. She let out a slow breath and felt something loosen in her chest that had been coiled there for 9 years. "That is not over," Hoy said beside her. "I know," Dorothy said, "but it is different now." "Very different," Hoy said. 47 motorcycles were running in the parking lot when they walked out. The sound of them starting up one by one, and then together, was something Dorothy felt in her sternum. She stood on the courthouse steps and listened to it, and did not move for a moment. Pete came to stand beside her. He did not say anything. He understood when silence was the right thing. She thought about Calvin on a Saturday morning in the Iron Ridge garage, coffee in hand, canvas in front of him, the world going quiet around him because he was in the work, and the work was where he was most fully himself. She thought about him on the second night of a charity ride, calling his wife to say "I love you," because he had already understood what he had found and had already decided he could not turn away from it. He had trusted the work. He had trusted her. He had trusted that what was built carefully enough and protected well enough would outlast the people trying to bury it. He had been right about all of it. The Attorney General's office moved faster than anyone had expected. Hoy called Dorothy 3 days after the hearing with the quiet satisfaction of someone delivering news that confirmed what they had suspected. The AG's office had already been conducting a preliminary inquiry into Langley's charitable organizations, Hoy said, for the past 18 months following an unrelated tip from a financial regulator. The inquiry had stalled for lack of specific documentation. A pause. Sandra Webb's 14-year pattern analysis entered into the court record as a public document gave their investigators the framework they needed to understand what they had already been sitting with. They were not starting from zero, Dorothy said. They were starting from halfway and didn't know it. We gave them the map. Calvin gave them the map. Yes, Hoy said, he did. The second development came from a direction no one had anticipated. One of the three men whose faces Calvin had painted into the crash scene, not Langley, one of the others contacted Hoy's office through a private attorney 5 days after the AG referral became public knowledge. He was 60 years old. He had been living under a different name in New Mexico for 8 years. He wanted to talk. He's willing to provide a full statement, Hoy told Dorothy. The crash, the planning before it, Langley's instructions, everything he witnessed and everything he did. His voice was careful. Dorothy, this is the testimony that turns the civil claim into a criminal prosecution. This is the case your son built completed. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. She was sitting in the kitchen with the morning light coming in and the sketchbook on the table where she had been looking at the last page again. Tell him yes, she said, and tell him something else. Tell him my son documented what happened because he believed the truth was worth protecting regardless of what it cost. If this man has been carrying what he carries for 9 years, he already understands what that cost looks like. He doesn't need me to explain it to him. The meeting happened on a Tuesday in a conference room in Flagstaff Neutral Ground halfway between everything. The man's real name was Thomas Guidry. He was thin and gray with the careful economy of someone who had been living carefully for a very long time and had gotten good at it in the way that people get good at things they never wanted to have to be good at. He sat across the table from Dorothy and looked at her and then at the table and then at her again. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of something compressed under long pressure releasing all at once. I've seen the photographs of your son's painting, he said. My attorney showed me the images from the court filing. He stopped. He got every detail right. He had maybe 40 minutes in that unit. 40 minutes and he got every face right. He was always exact, Dorothy said. Guidry looked at his hands. I want you to know I did not want to be there. Not because it changes anything. I know it doesn't. But because I have needed to say that to someone for 9 years, and I have not had the right person to say it to. He looked up at her directly. I owed Langley a significant debt. He told me it was to follow the motorcycle to make sure your son didn't reach anyone before Langley could manage the situation. He used the word managed. His voice tightened on the last word. I believed managed meant something different from what it meant. Dorothy held his gaze. She kept her hands flat on the table. She had been a triage nurse for 31 years. She had sat with people in their worst moments and had learned the specific discipline of giving them space to say the thing that needed saying without filling the space with her own reaction. When I understood what had actually happened, Guidry continued, it was too late to undo it. I was too afraid to come forward and too implicated to walk away. So I walked away in the other direction, and I have been living in that direction for 9 years. He pressed both hands flat on the table, mirroring her without meaning to. I am tired of it. I am tired of all of it. He looked at her. I will tell investigators everything. Every conversation, every instruction, every specific thing I know. It will not bring him back. I know that. No, Dorothy said, it won't. But it's what I have, Guidry said. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. She looked at a man destroyed from the inside by something he had failed to stop, who had been carrying the weight of that failure for nearly a decade, and was now ready to put it down the only way it could be put down. She felt something move through her that was not forgiveness, and not absolution, and not the absence of loss. It was something more specific. The recognition of what fear costs when you let it run long enough. Give your statement, she said. Tell the truth completely. She paused. That is all he ever wanted. That is everything this has ever been about. Guidry nodded once. His attorney began writing notes. Outside the conference room window, the Arizona afternoon was clear and bright and indifferent in the way of large things to the small, specific weights of the moments happening inside them. Victor Langley was arrested on a Wednesday morning, 8 weeks and 2 days after Dorothy Briggs had driven into the Iron Ridge compound with a sketchbook and a thermos of coffee. The charges were substantial: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, an account connected to the events on Route 9 9 years prior that the prosecutor's office had been constructing carefully since Guidry's full statement was recorded. Langley's attorneys were present at the arrest, which meant he had known it was coming. The fear Dorothy had seen in his eyes at the courthouse had fully arrived in the weeks since. Hoy called at 7 in the morning with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been doing this kind of work for 30 years and still felt the specific weight of a moment like this. "It is not the end of the process," Hoy said. "There is a long road between arrest and verdict. You understand that?" "I understand," Dorothy said. "But the painting is entered into evidence. Guidry's statement is on record. Bowen's witness statement is on record. The full financial analysis is on record." He paused. "Your son built something that survived 9 years and the best attorney money could hire. I want you to sit with that for a moment." Dorothy sat with it. She was in the garage when the call came at the same workbench where she had done the test painting on her first day, where the whole thing had begun. She set the phone down and held a brush without moving for a long moment. Then she put the brush down and called Renee. Renee picked up on the first ring. "I heard," Renee said before Dorothy could speak. Her voice held all three things at once: the relief and the grief and the tired, incomplete satisfaction of a thing finally arriving after you have been waiting for it so long that arrival itself has changed shape. "Rosa called me 10 minutes ago." "Mom," Renee said. The word landed with its full weight, the word she had used for Dorothy from the first year she and Calvin were married, long before it became the word she used when there was no one else. "The children," Dorothy said, "still asleep. I am going to tell them at breakfast. I want them to hear it in daylight with the ordinary morning around them." A pause. "He knew you would find it. I want you to know that I believe that. Not because he had a plan or because he knew you would come specifically, but when he rolled that canvas up and wrapped it and tied it, some part of him knew." Her voice was very steady. "He knew because you are you, Dorothy." Dorothy held the phone. She looked at the garage around her, at the workbenches and the tools and the accumulated years of a place that had held her son in the years when she was not with him. "He left it where I could find it," she said. "He left it where only you could find it," Renee said. After she hung up, Dorothy sat at the workbench and let herself feel the full weight of the morning. Not performing composure, not managing grief into usefulness. Just sitting with the fact of it. The fact that 9 years of looking had found what it was looking for. The fact that her son had known she would not stop. The fact that the knot he had tied in the dark had held for 9 years, waiting for her hands to untie it. She picked up the brush again. She began to work. The memorial ride was Hammer's idea, and it came together the way things come together in communities that have been waiting for a reason to properly gather and grieve organically and fast and larger than anyone had originally envisioned. It was set for a Saturday in late October, 6 weeks after the arrest, and what had been planned as a chapter event became something else entirely when word spread through the network of people who had known Calvin Briggs. Veterans organizations sent representatives. Former chapter members who had moved to other states called to say they were coming. People who had known Calvin in contexts separate from the chapter entirely. Customers who had commissioned artwork, artists who had known him from regional shows. People from the neighborhood in Kingman, where he had grown up, arrived at the Iron Ridge compound on the Saturday morning in numbers that made Deke, who was handling parking, genuinely creative in his logistics. 193 motorcycles by the final count. Dorothy moved through all of it with the calm that comes after a long period of sustained effort, reaches its resolution, the particular quality of presence that people have when they are no longer carrying something they have been carrying for a very long time and are learning what it feels like to have their hands free. She talked to people and shook hands and listened to stories about Calvin she had never heard before, received each one with the open attention of someone who understood that every story was a piece of a person. She was still building in full, still learning, still earning the right to know completely. She had been his mother. She had known him completely in certain ways and not at all in others. And that was not failure. That was simply the truth of how people exist in the world, partly known by every person who loves them and fully known by none. Rosa stayed close all morning without making it obvious. Carl arrived late and stood alone at the far edge of the lot for a few minutes before Dorothy walked over to him. He looked at her when she approached, and his jaw held its familiar set. "You kept the key," Dorothy said. "6 years," Carl said. "Thank you, Carl." He nodded once, the nod of a man who does not trust himself with more than that right now. Dorothy put her hand briefly on his arm and moved on because Carl was the kind of man who needed to know you understood and then needed you to let him carry the rest of it himself. Dutch appeared where he was needed and disappeared where he was not the way he always did. Pete stayed within reach without being obvious about it the way he had been doing since the first morning with the 2 cups of coffee. Deke ran the parking logistics with the cheerful determination of a man who has been given a meaningful job and intends to do it well. The ride left at noon. 193 motorcycles rolling out in formation through the October desert, the sound of them filling the air for miles ahead of their arrival and long after their passage. Dorothy rode in the support vehicle with Rosa, and they talked the whole way, not about Langley or the courts, or the case, just about Calvin. Stories Rosa had been keeping for 9 years, waiting for the right time and the right person. By the time the ride returned in the late afternoon, Dorothy knew her son more completely than she had known him that morning. That was the gift the day kept giving. Each person adding one more specific, true thing, building a person out of accumulated testimony, the way her son had built truth out of accumulated paint. You could not know anyone fully. You could only keep adding to what you had. She would be adding to Calvin for the rest of her life, and that was not a failure of knowledge. That was the shape of love. At the end of the afternoon, when the crowd had gathered in the main lot, and the food had been eaten, and the stories had been told, and the late October light had gone long and amber in particular, Hammer stepped up onto the back of a flatbed truck, and the crowd settled without being asked. His voice carried without a microphone the way voices carry when no one in the room wants to miss a word. Calvin Briggs was a brother and an artist, and a man who found the truth when it was dangerous to find it and documented it when documenting it cost him everything, Hammer said. He trusted that someone would eventually come looking for what he left behind. He looked at Dorothy at the edge of the gathered crowd. She looked back at him. "Someone came looking," Hammer said. "She drove 4 hours with a sketchbook and her son's hands and her son's eyes and more stubbornness than most people twice her age will ever find in themselves." A pause. "She asked if she could paint our bikes for tips." A sound moved through the crowd that was not quite laughter and not quite tears. Something in between that was uniquely human. "We owe her something better than tips," Hammer said. "Tonight she is going to show us something she has been working on for the past 3 months. And after that, anyone who wants to say something about Calvin Briggs can say it." He stepped down. Dorothy walked to the center of the lot, where the large canvas had been mounted on the frame that Deke and 2 others had built, in position facing the crowd. A dark cloth covered it. She stood in front of it and looked at the 193 people looking at her, at the Veterans Organization representatives, and the former members who had driven from other states, and the customers and the artists, and the people from Calvin's neighborhood in Kingman, and she decided not to say anything. Words had never been where she was most herself. She reached up and pulled the cloth free. The crowd went quiet in the way of people receiving something that requires a moment before a response is possible. The silence of genuine reception. The painting was 8 feet by 5, the largest thing Dorothy Briggs had ever made, worked on every evening for 3 months in this garage. After the day's other work was finished, alone with the process, the way her son had taught her that serious work needed to be done with your full attention in the room and everything else outside it. It showed a highway at night, not any specific highway, but the highway, the one that exists in the imagination of everyone who has ever understood that a road is not a metaphor, but a truth lit by the low blue of a clear desert sky and the gold of headlamps on asphalt, and the particular quality of dark that the desert holds between dusk and midnight. On that highway in formation riders, dozens of them rendered in Calvin style, the style she had spent 3 years earning the right to use, the expressionistic darkness and the emotional precision that had been his greatest gift. At the front of the formation, slightly ahead of the rest, a rider with broad shoulders and long arms, in the posture of a man who is completely and without reservation at home on the road he is on. Behind him and to the right, riding with the easy authority of someone who belongs exactly where she is, a woman. Silver hair, straight-backed, not chasing, riding beside. Above both of them, and above the whole formation in the clear letter forms, Calvin had taught her when she was teaching him that text and image were not separate things, four words. He never stopped riding. Pete made a sound he immediately tried to contain and could not contain. Deke turned to face the fence line. Dutch, who never showed anything, pressed the back of his hand to his mouth and looked up at the sky. Hammer stood very still in front of the painting and found the figure at the front of the highway and stayed with him for a long time. Whatever passed across Hammer's face in that moment was between him and Calvin Briggs, and Dorothy looked away and let it be private. The crowd was quiet for a long time, the real quiet of reception, and then one person began to clap. Then another. Then it was everyone. Dorothy stood in the middle of it and let it move through her. Rosa put a hand briefly on her back. Pete came to stand on her other side. Carl materialized at the edge of her vision. Dutch was there, and Deke and Jimmy and the others gathered around her the way they had gathered around Calvin for years, without ceremony, without announcement, because that was simply what they did for their own. Hammer walked over and stood in front of her. He looked at her with the same complete attention he had given her on the first day in the garage over the sketchbook. "You came here for answers," he said. "I did," Dorothy said. "Did you find them?" Dorothy looked at the painting, at the highway and the riders and her son at the front of all of it, and herself beside him, and the four words above them that said the things she had needed most to be able to say. "I found more than answers," she said. "I found what he was trying to tell me." "What was that?" Dorothy looked at Hammer, then at all of them. At the people who had kept a unit locked and a key in a drawer for 6 years, and a personal file in a garage for 9 years, and a memory alive for all of it. People who had ridden beside her son and were now standing beside his mother because that was what you did for your own. Because the road did not end at the last person who walked it. "He was trying to tell me," Dorothy said quietly, "that he never really left." Nobody spoke. The amber light held everything still for one long moment. Then Hammer said, "There's something I've been meaning to tell you, since the first day you walked through that gate." Dorothy looked at him. He said, 22 years ago, I came into the VA emergency room in Kingman in bad shape. A situation that went further than it was supposed to go. I lost a significant amount of blood before anyone got me there, and I was not conscious for most of what happened next." He stopped. "The nurse who admitted me and stayed with me through those first hours, I never knew her name. When I came around, there was a note on the table beside the bed." He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and took out a piece of paper folded many times over, many years soft with handling. He held it with the care you give to something you have carried so long, it has become part of how you understand yourself. "I kept it," he said, "every day for 22 years. I could not have told you why exactly. I just knew it was the kind of thing that needed to be kept." He looked at her. "When you walked into this garage with that sketchbook, something about you felt familiar and I could not place it. I thought it was because you moved like Calvin, but it wasn't that." He held out the note. Dorothy took it. She unfolded it carefully with steady hands. The paper was soft and worn along the fold lines, and the handwriting on it was faded but completely legible. She recognized it immediately, the way you recognize something you made yourself. "You are worth saving. Keep writing." She looked at Hammer. "I wrote notes like that sometimes," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "When someone came in whose chart said no next of kin and whose face looked like they had been in pain long before whatever had brought them to the emergency room that night." She looked at the paper. "I used to think of them as the thing I could do when the thing I was supposed to do wasn't enough. A note beside the bed that said someone had seen them." She paused. "I never knew what happened to any of them afterward." Hammer's face was doing something it rarely did. The deep stillness was still there, but something had moved underneath it and was showing at the surface. "You saved my life," he said. "Not just that night." He paused. "That note is part of why I kept writing when there were years I might not have. Years when the road felt like it was asking more than I had left to give." He looked at her steadily. Calvin rode with me for 4 years. He was a brother to me. He was one of the best people I have ever known in this life. Another pause. Your son and I were brothers because you once took 30 seconds to write a note to a stranger who needed to know someone had seen him. Dorothy held the paper in both hands and felt the specific weight of a connection that had been building for 22 years through people and events that had never known they were connected. The thread running from a note left beside a hospital bed, to a boy watching his mother's hands at a kitchen table, to a man who had kept writing because someone had told him he was worth saving, and that man had known Calvin. And Calvin had ridden beside him and painted in his garage and trusted him with what he had found, and now here they all were. The truth is in the work. Someone who knows how to look will find it. She had not known when she wrote that note that she was building something. She had not known that Calvin would ride into this man's life and become a brother to him, or that she would one day stand in this lot with everything she had come looking for finally in her hands. She had not known any of the specific shape of it, but she had put her hand on the work anyway, the way you put your hand on work, when you understand that doing it matters even when you cannot see where it is going. She folded the note carefully along its old creases and held it out to Hammer. "Keep it," she said. He took it. He put it back in his vest pocket over his heart, which was where it had been for 22 years. He looked at her for a long time with the expression of a man who has finally placed a face he has been carrying in memory for 2 decades, and found that placing it changes nothing and changes everything simultaneously. Calvin used to say, Hammer said, that his mother was the reason he understood that the small things were the ones that lasted, that the things you did when no one was watching were the ones that built something that could outlast you. Dorothy looked at the painting one more time, at her son at the front of the highway, with the whole formation behind him and the dark sky above, and the road going on as far as the painted canvas allowed. At herself riding beside him. He was right about that, she said. The October evening was settling into the desert the way evenings settle gradually and completely, turning the sky above the compound, the deep blue of a desert dusk. Around Dorothy, the crowd was beginning to move in the way of communities that have been through something together and are now on the other side of it. Small conversations starting, people finding each other. The gentle reorganization of a gathering that has done what it came to do. Rosa took Dorothy's arm gently. "Come sit down," she said. "You have been standing for hours." Dorothy let herself be led. She sat at one of the long tables, and Rosa was on one side of her, and Pete on the other, and Carl sat across from her, and the painting was visible over the heads of the assembled crowd, her son at the front of a highway that had no end. Hammer sat down across from Carl and looked at Dorothy for a moment. "What happens next?" he said. He did not mean legally, he meant to her. What she was going to do with her days now that the thing she had been doing for 9 years had found its completion. Dorothy thought about it. She picked up the coffee Rosa had set in front of her and held it in both hands, and looked at the painting and thought about what came after the answer. "I'm going to keep painting," she said. "Calvin taught me things I had not finished learning when he disappeared. I still have work to do in the direction he pointed me." She paused. "He went further than I did. I am still following." Hammer nodded, the slow nod of a man for whom that answer made complete sense. "We have 6 bikes in the shop that need custom work," he said. "If you are interested." Dorothy looked at him. "What's the pay?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Better than tips." "I'll think about it," Dorothy said. But she was already thinking. Yes, already thinking about the garage in the mornings, with the roll-up doors open, and the desert light coming in, and the work in front of her, and the smell of turpentine, and the particular quality of attention that serious work required, the quality that her son had learned from watching her, and then gone further with than she had imagined, the quality that was the most important thing she had ever passed on to anyone. She thought about the words on the last page of the sketchbook. The truth is in the work. If you can't say it out loud, build it in. Someone who knows how to look will find it. She had found it. She had brought it home. She had done what 9 years of not stopping had been building toward. Now there was more work to do. There was always more work to do. That was the thing her son had understood, that she had taught him without knowing she was teaching it. The work did not end. The road did not end. You kept going because going was how you honored everything you had been given and everything that had been taken and everyone who had trusted you to keep your hands on the work when the work was the only thing that could outlast everything else. Dorothy Briggs, 74 years old, Claude, a triage nurse, mother of Calvin, wife of Ray Woman who had driven 4 hours and 11 minutes on a September morning with a sketchbook and a thermos of black coffee, and her son's last words pressed into the spine of a dark green notebook, sat at a long table in the Iron Ridge compound in the amber October light with 47 witnesses and 193 motorcycles and a painting above the crowd that said what needed to be said. And she drank her coffee and she let the evening go on around her. He never stopped writing. Neither would she. 3 days after the arrest, Renee drove up from Tucson with the children. Brianna was 15 and Lucas was 12, and they arrived at the Iron Ridge compound on a Thursday afternoon in Renee's sedan, the two of them leaning forward in the back seat as the car came down the gravel road and the compound came into view with its long garage bay and its gathering of motorcycles and its particular compressed energy of a place that did a great deal of living inside its perimeter. Dorothy met them in the parking lot. Brianna got out first. She was tall for 15 Calvin's height already with her father's broad shoulders and her mother's precise dark eyes. She stood in front of Dorothy and looked at her grandmother for a long moment without speaking the particular assessment of a teenager who has been thinking about something serious for a long time and is now arriving at the place where the serious thing is real. "Grandma," she said. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around Dorothy and held on. Dorothy held her back. She held her the way you hold someone when you understand that the embrace is doing multiple things at once, that it is for now and for 9 years ago, and for all the years in between, and that it is enough to just be the person who is there to hold and let the holding be what it needs to be. Lucas hung back by the car until Dorothy looked at him. He was built like Calvin at 12, still growing into his frame with the watchful eyes of a boy who processed things carefully before committing to a response. Calvin had been exactly like that at his age. Dorothy remembered it with a clarity that 9 years had not softened. "Come here, Lucas," she said. He came. Renee stood at the edge of the parking lot and watched her children being held by their grandmother, and her face held everything it had held on the phone, the relief and the grief and the complicated satisfaction of a thing arriving after a very long wait. Dorothy looked at her over the children's heads. Renee nodded once, just once. The nod of a woman who had held herself and her family together for 9 years on the faith that the truth was somewhere and that someone would find it. That nod contained all of that. Later, Dorothy took Brianna and Lucas into the garage. It was a weekday afternoon and most of the compound was quiet. The regional gathering long dispersed, only the chapter's regular members coming and going. Hammer was in the back office. Pete was at the far workbench with a fuel line he was replacing. Deke was doing something with a torque wrench that involved periodic satisfied grunting. Dorothy introduced them without ceremony, which was the right register for introducing people in a working garage. Lucas immediately went to stand near Pete, drawn by the specifics of the mechanical work in the way that 12-year-old boys are drawn to things being taken apart and reassembled. Pete showed him what he was doing with the patient explanatory manner of a man who had never entirely stopped finding these things interesting and was always faintly surprised that not everyone did. Brianna stood in the middle of the garage and looked around at the workbenches and the tools and the motorcycles in various states of completion, and then looked at the fuel tank that had been returned to its place on the side bench, the one Dorothy had painted on the first day. "Is that yours?" Brianna said. She was standing in front of it with her head slightly tilted, the precise posture Dorothy recognized from watching Calvin look at work he was trying to understand fully. "I painted it," Dorothy said. "Yes." Brianna looked at it for a long time. She had her grandmother's eyes in the end. Calvin had given them his own particular quality of attention, but the eyes themselves had come through Dorothy from her own father, the same dark brown with the same specific capacity for staying with a thing until you understood it. "It looks like Dad's work," Brianna said. "He learned from me," Dorothy said. And then he went further. "I spent 3 years following where he went." She paused. "Some of what you're seeing in that is his. Some is mine. They're not entirely separable anymore." Brianna looked at the tank for another moment. Then she looked at Dorothy. "Can you teach me Dorothy looked at her granddaughter at the 15 years of Calvin in her face, and the 9 years of Renee's particular steady strength, and the entirely her own quality of directness that came from somewhere in the combination and had its own character that neither parent had fully. Yes, Dorothy said, I can teach you. She thought about a kitchen table and a boy who sat across from her watching her hands. She thought about what it meant to pass something forward, not only the technique, but the understanding underneath the technique. The belief that building truth into what you made was the most important thing a person with skilled hands could do. She thought about Calvin at 19 learning the double knot. She thought about him at 31 using it one last time. She looked at Brianna. Come back Saturday morning, she said. We will start with the basics and go from there. Brianna nodded with the gravity of someone accepting a serious commitment. Dorothy recognized that gravity. She had seen it in Calvin at the same age when she had told him she was ready to teach him properly if he was ready to learn properly. He had nodded exactly that way. The days that followed the arrest moved with the particular rhythm of legal processes, which is to say they moved both faster and slower than expected in different respects simultaneously, and Dorothy learned to track the parts that mattered and let the rest proceed at its own pace without drawing too much of her attention. Guidry's full statement had been recorded and turned over to prosecutors. The financial analysis that Sandra Webb had built on the 14-year pattern was being reviewed by two separate federal agencies since the scope of the fraud crossed state lines in ways that brought additional jurisdictions into consideration. Ray Bowen's recovered witness statement had been officially re-entered into the original case record by order of the court, and the officer who had removed it from the original file was himself under separate investigation. Langley's attorneys were fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, which was precisely the situation Hoy had designed the expanded scope of the case to create. Every time Vance tried to narrow the focus, the Veterans Organization attorneys and the federal agencies pushed it back out. The ownership claim over the painting had been effectively abandoned after the first hearing. Langley's team no longer had a viable argument that the painting was his, which meant they could not suppress it, which meant it stayed in evidence, which meant everything Calvin had built into it stayed in the public record. Dorothy understood that the road from here to a final verdict was long and would have difficult stretches. Hoy had told her this plainly, and she believed him. She was 74 years old and had spent 9 years at this and was not operating under any illusions about how long institutions took to complete their work. But the work was in motion. Calvin's work was in the hands of the people whose job it was to act on it. What she had needed to do, she had done. She painted. Every morning from 7 to noon in the Iron Ridge garage with Hammer's agreement, and eventually with a section of the workbench informally designated as hers, she worked. 6 bikes came through in the first 3 weeks, and she painted all of them, each one a conversation between her own developing style and the techniques Calvin had taught her, and the particular requirements of each specific piece of metal. Pete started bringing 2 cups of coffee again in the mornings. He never said anything about it. It simply became something that happened the way certain habits establish themselves in shared spaces through repetition and mutual acknowledgement, and the quiet agreement of people who have decided to be in the same place. Hammer watched her work from across the garage. Sometimes the same still attention he gave to everything, and occasionally he made a comment that was not quite a compliment, but was something more useful, a specific observation about a choice she had made that let her understand what he saw when he looked at her work. She had spent enough time around serious craftspeople to recognize this as the highest form of acknowledgement available in a working garage, and she received it accordingly. Rosa brought her lunch most days, which Dorothy accepted without comment and without excessive gratitude because Rosa was the kind of person who communicated care through practical action and who would have found effusive thanks more awkward than the care itself. They ate at the corner of the workbench and talked about things that had nothing to do with the case. Rosa's family and Dorothy's memories of Kingman before the hospital expanded, and the particular problem Rosa was having with the chapter's accounting software, which had been updated without adequate notice and was now doing something inexplicable with the quarterly reports. Dorothy solved the accounting software problem on a Tuesday afternoon, which surprised Rosa and did not surprise Dorothy at all, because 31 years in a large institution teaches you that accounting software is always doing something inexplicable with quarterly reports, and there are only ever three causes. Carl came by the garage twice a week and sat in the folding chair at the end of the workbench and watched Dorothy work and occasionally said something and occasionally said nothing, and in both cases was present in the specific way of a man who needed to be near the place where the thing he had been keeping safe was finally being used properly. Dorothy had come to understand Carl as a person whose way of loving things was to guard them quietly for as long as necessary. She thought this was a form of devotion that did not always get the credit it deserved. Dutch appeared when he appeared and said what he said, and Dorothy had stopped trying to predict either. He had told her once that Calvin used to make the same coffee for everyone without asking. She had understood that this was the most personal thing Dutch was going to say to her, and she had received it with the weight it deserved. On Saturdays, Brianna came. Dorothy taught her the way her own father had taught her, and the way she had taught Calvin, not with lesson plans or formal structure, but with work in front of them, and her hands doing the thing and Brianna's eyes doing what eyes do when they are genuinely paying attention. She started with line control, the foundation of everything, the specific discipline of making the hand do what the eye intended rather than what it was comfortable doing. Calvin had learned this in 4 Saturday mornings. Brianna was faster. She had her grandmother's patience and her father's eye, and something that was entirely her own, a quality of willingness to be bad at something while learning that many talented people struggle to sustain. She would make a mark she didn't like, look at it fully, understand what had gone wrong, and try again without drama. Dorothy watched this and thought, yes, you have it, you just don't know yet what you have. Lucas came with Brianna most Saturdays and spent the mornings with Pete learning mechanical work and asking questions at the particular rate of 12-year-olds who have found a subject that genuinely interests them, which is to say at a rate that required Pete to answer approximately one question every 4 minutes for 3 hours. Pete appeared to find this entirely acceptable. One Saturday in November, 6 weeks after the memorial ride, Dorothy was at the workbench with Brianna when Hammer walked in and set a piece of paper on the workbench beside Dorothy's current project without saying anything. She looked at it. It was a check made out to Dorothy Briggs for the 6 custom paint jobs she had completed in the past month. She looked at the number. "That's considerably better than tips," she said. "I told you," Hammer said. "You did," Dorothy said. She folded the check and put it in her shirt pocket. "I'll be back Monday." Hammer nodded and walked back toward the office. Dorothy picked up her brush and went back to work. Brianna was watching her from the other stool. "Are you going to stay?" Brianna said. Dorothy looked at this garage around her, at the workbenches and the tools and the motorcycles and the light coming in through the open bay doors, and the particular smell of the place that she had first recognized as the smell of her son's studio and now recognized as something of its own. At Pete, visible through the garage door, showing Lucas how to check oil. At Rosa through the window of the office doing something with the accounting software again. At Carl's chair at the end of the workbench, empty this morning but present. "For a while," Dorothy said. "Good," Brianna said. She looked at the fuel tank Dorothy was working on. "Can I try that part, the border work?" "Let me show you the mechanics of it first," Dorothy said. "Then you try." She moved the fuel tank so Brianna could see the angle she was working from and began to show her the specific wrist movement required for the border work technique, the same movement Calvin had learned from her at the kitchen table 20-some years ago and had refined into something she was still learning from. She explained what she was doing and why she was doing it, and she watched Brianna's eyes and knew from the watching that it was landing. This was teaching. This was how it worked. You showed the thing to the right person at the right time, and the thing went forward into the world past the reach of what you could see. Calvin had understood this. He had built his most important truth into the most durable form he knew, in a language only the right person could read, and he had left it where that person could find it. He had trusted the work, and the work had held. Dorothy showed her granddaughter the border work technique on a November morning in a garage in Kingman, Arizona, with the desert outside and the sound of an engine somewhere across the lot, and the particular quality of attention in the room that serious work produces when it is being done and being learned simultaneously. This was also how truth survived, not only in paint on canvas in a locked unit, in hands, in the passing of one person's knowing into another person's hands and eyes in eventual skill. She thought about the last words in the sketchbook one more time. The truth is in the work. If you can't say it out loud, build it in. Someone who knows how to look will find it. She had found it. Now she was building it forward. Brianna made her first attempt at the border work, and it was technically imperfect and exactly right in the way that first attempts are, right when the person making them understands what they are reaching for. Dorothy looked at it for a moment. Good, she said. Do it again. Brianna did it again. Better this time. The wrist movement cleaner, the pressure more consistent, the eye more accurately translating what it saw into what the hand did. Dorothy watched and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The work was speaking for itself the way serious work always did when the right hands were on it, the way her father's work had spoken, the way hers had spoken to Calvin, the way Calvin's had spoken to 50 people in a garage on a September morning when a woman had set a sketchbook on a workbench and stepped back and waited. Outside, the November light was clean and hard, and the desert was doing what it did, holding everything it had been given without apology. The motorcycles in the lot stood in their rows. The compound was alive with its ordinary morning men and engines, and the accumulated sound of a place that had been living this particular kind of life for decades and intended to go on doing so. Dorothy Briggs, 74 years old, sat at a workbench in the Iron Ridge garage with her granddaughter and put her hands on the work. This was enough. This was, in fact, exactly enough. The road went on. The work went on. The truth that Calvin had built with his last careful hours had found its way into the world and was doing what truth does when it is built well enough and protected long enough and finally released into the right hands. It went forward. It did not stop. It never stopped. The hearing that mattered most happened on a Thursday in December, 2.5 months after the arrest, in a courtroom in Phoenix that was larger than the one that had held the preliminary hearing and held more people accordingly. Dorothy drove down with Hoy the night before and stayed in a hotel 2 blocks from the courthouse in a room with a view of the parking garage across the street, and she sat at the small desk and wrote 2 letters. One was to Renee, and it said, the things she had not always said clearly enough during the 9 years of looking, about how Renee's steadiness had been something Dorothy had relied on without always acknowledging it. About the way Renee had raised Calvin's children with the patience and directness that Calvin had loved in her, and that Dorothy had come to love in her separately, in her own right, not as a reflection of Calvin, but as herself. The second letter was to Brianna and Lucas, and it said what she wanted them to know about their father. Not the whole of it. She was still learning the whole of it herself, but the specific true things she was most certain of and most wanted to make sure they had clearly from someone who had known him before anyone else had known him. She folded both letters and addressed them and put them in her bag to send when she got back to Kingman. Then she went to sleep. The hearing lasted most of the day. Guidry testified. His voice was controlled and his account was precise, and he answered every question from the prosecution and every question from Vance with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided that accuracy is the only thing he has left to offer and is going to offer it completely. Dorothy watched him from the gallery and understood that the 9 years of fear had not made him smaller the way fear sometimes does, but had made him very careful. And that carefulness was serving the truth now in the way it had previously been serving his survival. Ray Bowen testified. He walked through the original investigation, the witness statement, the specific sequence by which the statement had been removed from the official file, and his own decision to maintain a private copy. He was unshakable under cross-examination because everything he said was a fact, and Vance had no facts with which to contradict facts. Dr. Marsh testified about the painting. She was on the stand for 90 minutes, and she walked the court through the authentication analysis with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the work she had done needed to be presented in a way that made its integrity undeniable, and it was. Sandra Webb testified about the financial analysis. The Veterans Organization attorneys presented the documented harm to their clients' allocations across all 6 events over 14 years. Hoy did not raise his voice once. At the end of the day, the judge set the trial date. The ownership claim on the painting had been definitively dismissed. The painting itself, Calvin's painting, the one he had rolled and wrapped and double knotted in a storage unit on Route 9, with 40 minutes and whatever he had left, was formally entered into the evidentiary record for the criminal trial as Exhibit 1. Dorothy sat in the gallery and looked at the photograph of the painting on the large screen the prosecution had used for the testimony and felt the particular quality of a thing being received by the world in the way it was built to be received. She thought about what her son had done. He had walked into a storage unit injured in the dark with a limited amount of time, and he had made the most important thing he had ever made in the only language he fully trusted, because he understood that what was built in that language and built with enough care could survive everything that would come after it. He had trusted the work. The work had lasted. She walked out of the courthouse into the December Phoenix afternoon with Hoy beside her and the Veterans Organization attorneys a few steps ahead and Ray Bowen coming down the steps at her left. And she stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at the sky, which was the particular blue of a clear Arizona December sky, very clean and very high, and she let herself feel all of it for a moment before she was ready to move. Bowen stopped beside her. He had said what he needed to say on the stand today, and his face had the particular quality of a burden put down properly. "Mrs. Briggs," he said. "Ray," she said. She had started calling him Ray in the weeks since the preliminary hearing, and he had accepted this without comment. "Your son would have been something," Bowen said, "if he had gotten to keep going." "He was something," Dorothy said. "He did not need more time to be that." Bowen looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once the way men nod when they have heard something true and do not need to add to it. Dorothy walked to Hoy's car. She got in. She looked at the courthouse in the side mirror as they pulled away. She thought about the drive home to Kingman, 4 hours and however many minutes back through the desert that had been the same desert on the morning she had driven the other direction, with a sketchbook and a thermos of coffee, and nothing except the specific knowledge that she was not done looking. She was not done now either. She would never be entirely done. That was not how this worked. You did not reach a place called done. You reached places where what you had done mattered, and where the road ahead was different than the road behind, and you kept going because going was what you did with the life you had been given, and the skills you had been given, and the people you had been given, the gift of loving. She thought about Brianna on Saturday morning at the workbench making her first attempt at the border work technique and doing it again when it was not right the first time without drama. Just again. She thought about Lucas asking Pete questions at the rate of one every 4 minutes for 3 hours, and Pete answering all of them with the patient pleasure of a man who had never entirely lost the ability to find these things interesting. She thought about the sketchbook in her bag, which she still carried with her, not from habit, but from intention, because the words on the last page were something she intended to keep near her for the rest of her life. The truth is in the work. If you can't say it out loud, build it in. Someone who knows how to look will find it. She had looked. She had found it. Now she was building it forward in the direction he had pointed, one morning at a time, one painting at a time, one granddaughter learning a technique at a workbench at a time, until what he had built in her and what he had built in his work and what he had trusted her to find were all part of the same going forward that did not stop and was not supposed to stop. It went on. It went on in Brianna's hands learning the border work. It went on in Hammer carrying a folded note in his vest pocket over his heart. It went on in Carl's empty chair at the end of the workbench present, even when he was not. It went on in Pete's 2 cups of coffee every morning delivered without comment. It went on in every painting Dorothy made in the Iron Ridge garage in the mornings when the desert light came in through the open bay doors, and the work was in front of her, and the world was quiet in the way it went quiet when serious work was being done. It went on in the painting on the compound lot that showed a highway and a formation of riders and 2 people at the front of it, one slightly ahead and one riding beside, and 4 words above them that said what needed to be said without anything extra. He never stopped riding. Dorothy Briggs looked out the car window at the desert going past, and the sky above it, and the road ahead, and she held the sketchbook in her lap with both hands, and she did not stop. She got back to Kingman at 9:30 that evening. The compound was dark when she passed it on the highway, the gate closed, the lot quiet. She would be back Monday morning. She drove on through to her house, the small house on Merritt Street that had been hers and Ray's, and then just hers, and that had Calvin's memory in every room in a different way. The kitchen table where he had watched her paint, the hallway closet where she had kept his sketchbooks for 3 years before she gave them to herself, the back bedroom that had been his before he moved into his own apartment, and that was now the room where Brianna and Lucas slept when they stayed. She parked the truck and sat in the cab for a moment with the engine off. The house was quiet. The neighborhood was quiet. The Arizona December night was cold and clear in the way of desert nights, the stars present and numerous. She thought about a September morning in 4 hours and 11 minutes in a sketchbook on the passenger seat. She thought about an October evening in 193 motorcycles and a painting above a crowd that said 4 words. She thought about a December afternoon in a courtroom and Exhibit 1 on a screen and everything Calvin had built in 40 minutes in the dark, finally in the hands it had been built for. She picked up the sketchbook from the passenger seat. She had not set it down on the drive home. She had held it in her lap the whole way, the same way she had held it on the drive south the night before, the same way she had been holding it or keeping it within reach for 3 months now. She looked at the initials pressed into the lower right corner of the dark green cover. CB. She held it for a moment. Then she got out of the truck and went inside and put the kettle on and sat at the kitchen table, the same table, and opened the sketchbook to the last page and read the words one more time in the quiet of the house that still held everyone it had held. The truth is in the work. If you can't say it out loud, build it in. Someone who knows how to look will find it. She closed the sketchbook. The kettle began to sound. She got up and made her tea and brought it back to the table and sat with it and let the quiet of the house be what it was, which was both empty and full, in the specific way of a place that has held a great deal of living and holds the record of it in every surface and every smell and every particular quality of the light at different times of day. She was 74 years old. She had driven 4 hours and 11 minutes on a September morning with a sketchbook and a thermos of black coffee, and the specific knowledge that she was not done looking, and she had found what she went looking for, and she had brought it home, and the work that needed doing after the finding was in motion. There was more painting to do. There was Brianna on Saturday mornings. There was the garage with the bay doors open and the light coming in, and Pete's 2 cups of coffee and the work in front of her, and the particular quality of a day with serious work in it that her son had understood better than anyone she had ever known. There was the road. There was always the road. Dorothy Briggs drank her tea in the quiet kitchen of her house in Kingman, Arizona, on a December night with the stars out, and she let the day settle into its proper place in the long sequence of days that had led here, and she thought about what came next with the focused, practical attention of a woman who had never confused stopping with arriving. She was not stopped. She was here. That was enough. That was in every way that mattered exactly enough. In the morning, she would drive back to Iron Ridge. She would walk into the garage and pick up a brush and begin the day's work. And the day would hold what it held, and she would meet it the way she had always met things, directly and without flinching and with both hands on whatever the work required of her. She had been a triage nurse for 31 years. She knew that the most important thing you could do when you arrived somewhere was to look at what was actually there. Not what you expected or feared or hoped to find, but what was genuinely in front of you. And then you put your hands on the work. That was what she had done. That was what she would keep doing. She was Dorothy Briggs. She was 74 years old. She was her son's mother and her granddaughter's teacher, and a painter who was still learning what her own hands could do, still following the path that Calvin had pointed down in the years before she lost him, and the 3 years after she found his sketchbooks and understood that losing him was not the same thing as losing the direction. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The kitchen was warm and the tea was good, and outside the December stars were doing what stars do in the Arizona desert, burning clear and cold, and very far away and present anyway, the way certain true things are always present, even at a distance, even across time, even after everything that distance and time have taken. She sat with that for a while. Then she rinsed her cup and turned off the light and went to bed. She would be up at 6. There was work to do.